Your attention. Let's begin. Let me have your attention. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. But before I introduce today's speaker, there's some student awards that I would like to give out. In particular, these are Student Design Competition Awards. Each year, our students participate in the National Student Design Competition sponsored by the American Nuclear Society. We've been doing this for 30 years now, and in 28 of those 30 years, our students have been selected as finalists in the design competition. And last year was no different. Both our undergraduate entry and our graduate entry were selected as finalists. These students received an all-expense-paid trip to the national meeting in Washington, D.C., where they presented their results. And a few of them are here today. They're also going to receive certificates. And I want to recognize these students. And that not all of them are here because some of them had gone to work since last year. And so let me read the names first, and then I know that 4 of the students are here. So the undergraduate students that were on the design team, it was Matthew Francis, Brandon Catalanato, Jennifer Cole, Geraldo Belatkas, Nishka Devage, and Jonathan Pope. And on this team, I believe at least 2 of the students are here. Matthew Francis. Matthew, would you please come forward? Congratulations. Thank you very much. And also, is Nishka here? Nishka Devage? Okay. Nishka, if you come forward. Congratulations.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, now on the graduate student entry competition, there were 4 students on this design team: Robert Woolley, Zia Faze-Tompkins, Robert Kopechny, and Gary Sweeter. And I should point out that 2 of these students are distant students. They're physically not located on campus. And so this team had 2 local students and 2 distant students. And apparently they did pretty well because they were selected as finalists. And we do have the 2 local students with us today. That's Zia Faze-Tompkins. Zia, would you please come forward? Congratulations. Okay. And Gary Sweeter, who also happens to play on our basketball team. He's a very good basketball player. Congratulations. Okay. You can come in. Now to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Gary Smith. He is Professor of Radiology and Medicine, and he's also the Director of Nuclear Medicine at the University of Tennessee Medical Center here in Knoxville. Gary received a B.S. in Engineering Science from UT in 1978. In other words, this is an engineer who went on to go to medical school. He worked for about a year after getting his B.S. degree for Texas Instruments. And then he entered medical school at the University of Texas Medical Center in 1979. He graduated in 1983. After that, he did a residency in internal medicine at the UT Hospital here locally. And during that residency, he did research on PET scan machines, which is where he sort of got interested in imaging. Of course, the PET scan is positron emission tomography, as most everyone knows. And then later on, he did a residency in nuclear medicine at UCLA. Then he returned and joined the UT Medical Center in 1989. The title of his presentation today is Radiation Accidents, a Summary of Injury Incidences since 1945. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Gary Smith.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lee. I do appreciate the technical guys putting up with me because I'm a Mac guy and I couldn't transfer my slides over quite so easily, so thank you very much. This topic today is obviously not straight in line with nuclear medicine, although there's a little bit of overlap. I got interested in this because one of my partners, Dr. Carl Hubner, wrote a book years ago on radiation accidents. It was the proceedings of a symposium from the Oak Ridge Institute for Science Education, and actually they've had about 4 or 5 of these over the years, the last one about 3 years ago. But I was actually in San Diego giving a talk at the Academy of Molecular Imaging, and I needed a little bit of background information on the topic that I was given, some demographics on the talk that I was going to talk about. And I thought I'd go to the UC San Diego library to get that the day before the talk. And as I was walking through the stacks, one of the books off the shelf just caught my eye. It was Dr. Huebner's book. I didn't even know he had written it. And I pulled it off the shelf and realized this is my partner that I've been working with for about 20 years. I didn't know he had written this book years ago, and I picked it up and literally spent the entire afternoon in the UC San Diego library reading this book. It was a fascinating account of some of the injury incidents that have occurred in radiology and the nuclear field, literally dating back to the inception in the 1940s. That book is available now. It's updated each time they have one of the symposia. But I thought that for our residents in nuclear medicine who rarely hear about this topic in radiobiology, I thought it would be an interesting overview. So I gave that talk, and actually one of the professors here, Larry Miller, attended that talk a couple months ago over at UT Hospital, and he saw it and asked me to present it here. So it's your fault, Larry. So, so thank you for asking me. I think it'll be fun to go through this. Now, a lot of it, I have to tell you, talking to my residents is fairly easy because I can kind of fudge on a little bit of the factual information with respect to nuclear science. They don't know the difference sometimes, but I can't fudge on that with you all. So if you catch me in something, please shout. Okay, let me know. But give me a little bit of forgiveness in it, and that I'm not quite as sophisticated in the nuclear science as you are. So I do want to start out by basically doing an overview of the biological effects of radiation and define what a significant exposure is. We all are exposed to radiation daily, and if you have medical tests, even more than daily sometimes. In terms of the Department of Energy significant exposure, I'll define that. And then go through the different types of radiation accidents and give a couple little examples, again, from Dr. Huebner's work on the types of accidents that have occurred. And then what I did for the residents in nuclear medicine and the faculty for radiology is consider what our roles are in disaster planning. And you all, as nuclear engineers and so forth, will get involved, I'm sure, at some point in radiation safety aspects, and what the role in terms of radiation disaster planning is an important consideration. And we certainly have to think about that at the hospital. But the hospital is really the last line for radiation accident victims. The front line comes outside, and oftentimes people who are exposed really never even reach us. So it's something that happens out in industry oftentimes. The book from Dr. Huebner that I mentioned is The Medical Basis for Radiation Accident Preparedness, and you can look that up. It's actually in a new revision now. But there are numerous sites that I gathered source data from, including the last one here, which is the REACT site in Oak Ridge. And actually, for anybody interested in the medical aspects of radiation contamination or radiation exposure, the REACT offers some training courses that are actually very good overviews of how to handle an accident. So this is kind of background for you, but the types of radiation: alpha, beta, gamma radiation. In nuclear medicine, we use predominantly gamma rays for diagnosis and beta particle therapy, beta particle isotopes for therapy applications, I-131 being the predominant one that we use for therapy for thyroid disease. But there is some new work in alpha particle radiation with some of the new actinium 225 and so forth, chelated to antibodies to do radio antibody therapy. And then, of course, you know that X-rays are used for diagnosis as well as for therapy, radiation therapy purposes. In terms of the radiation in the environment, the background radiation, I try to stress to our people, is about 300 millirem per year. And it varies from location to location a little bit, but in general, about half to two-thirds of that comes from radon, which is ubiquitous and in the environment. There are things that you can do to minimize radon exposure, and there are things you can do to accidentally increase your radon exposure. But in general, about two-thirds comes from radon, and about a quarter or so of the natural background radiation comes from cosmic and terrestrial activity. And then the majority of the rest comes from either medical tests such as CT scans, medical X-rays, and nuclear medicine tests. But in general, the natural background is about 300 millirem per year, or if I can get my residents to remember, 1 millirem per day. We're pretty close. So that's kind of the number that we need to remember. Biologic effects include a range of effects. If you go down to the cellular level, you can identify cellular sensitivity in terms of DNA damage, free radical formation, breaks directly to protein and RNA chains, and so the cellular effects can be measured through some of the microscopic techniques. Organ sensitivity, in terms of biologic effects, are usually manifest as changes in enzyme levels in the bloodstream and so forth. And then whole body sensitivity with systemic disease. And this is the whole body sensitivity is what you typically think of when you think of radiation syndromes, and when you see the movies, all the movies that highlight people who've been accidentally exposed. What was the submarine movie K-19? And then the Fat Man Little Boy movie, which was actually a pretty very well done account of that incident. But these are the syndromes that you see in terms of whole body radiation doses. And what we see here is the days of survival plotted against the radiation dose in REM. So, and the axis begins at 100 REM on the bottom left and plots the days of survival. And you notice that the first syndrome that's defined is the hematologic syndrome, and I should stress that there's significant overlap between these. But the hematologic syndrome is manifest by a depression in blood counts. All the blood counts, white cell counts, red cell counts, and platelet counts in the bloodstream will all decrease if exposed to high enough level of radiation. And we see that actually with some of our therapies today. We have to follow patients for suppression of their bone marrow with therapy applications that we use currently in nuclear medicine. Past the hematologic syndrome, and typically that recovers if it's not too severe. You'll see a recovery of the blood counts. Past that level, though, is the gastrointestinal syndrome, in which patients will have severe diarrhea, vomiting, and so forth, manifest as mainly GI symptoms, and that very quickly, with increasing doses, proceeds to what's called the neurologic syndrome, and those patients typically die very quickly. As you can see, this is a log scale on the left, and by the time you get to a neurologic syndrome, the survival time is measured in days. That's the syndrome that's so well characterized in the movies, and I think anyone who's seen any of those movies knows kind of how it's portrayed in that. Actually, in one of the accident reports from Chernobyl, an individual who was exposed literally to in the order of 10,000 REM was able to walk out of the facility and talk to his rescuers, if you will, and for a period of time before he showed any symptoms at all, and then very quickly began to show symptoms and became comatose and died within a day of that exposure. But it was reported that he was actually lucid and walked out talking without any evidence of disease immediately after the exposure. Well, if you look at where the LD5030 is on this for man, it's about 300 to 400 rem. The LD5030 is defined as the lethal dose at which about 50% of the individuals will die after 30 days. And if you look at the level of that in rem, in man it's about 400, but you can see these various species have different levels of tolerance to radiation, down to the goldfish, which is 2,300. I guess they'll survive a fairly high dose. And actually, at my last talk, one of my residents said, you ought to tell what the cockroach's LD5030 is. I don't know how many cockroaches are alive 30 days after, if you collect a bunch of cockroaches and just keep them in a box, how many of them will be alive after 30 days anyway? But it's reported, I had to go to the web, and it's reported to be about 5,000 rem. And it's been called the apocryphal value because that's the only thing that's been said that will survive an atomic a third world war, I guess. So, but there is some data to suggest that that's actually a very low number, and you need to look at something like this. This is a bacterium, Deinococcus radiodurans, which actually fairly regularly is reported. There are scientific reports because it's so much of interest. This particular bacterium has all the repair systems for DNA repair, for desiccation recovery, and so forth. Genetic redundancy, there are multiple copies of the genome in this bacterium. And it can survive doses over 1 million rem, and still you can literally shatter its DNA, and within a few hours it'll be replicating again. And it can repair that DNA break, and it's interesting. So there are species that can survive extremely high doses, and one of the things I mentioned in the last talk was it kind of begs the question of where the evolutionary pressure was to be able to survive such a high dose. And later in the talk I'll give a slide that shows perhaps maybe where that came from. The biologic effects of radiation are considered to be a linear dose response model down to a certain threshold dose. Now, when I first put this together, the lower limit of this, if you plot the number of malignancies versus the radiation dose, it is fairly linear after you get above a certain threshold, and that threshold is considered to be about 100,000 millirem, or excuse me, 100 rem. Now, when you get past that level, it's fairly linear. The question is what happens below that threshold level, and there are various theories. Currently, the federal government considers this to be a linear model all the way down to zero, so that at whatever level of radiation you're exposed to, it increases your risk of malignancy or radiation effects. So there is the linear model, which suggests that all radiation carries a risk, and that's a linear response all the way down to the origin. However, there is a threshold model which suggests that there is a certain threshold dose of radiation above which you begin to see radiation effects, but below which the body has repair mechanisms in place that can repair any damage, and you won't have an increase in risk. And then there's the hormesis model, and there is some data to suggest that there's an optimal level of background radiation which the body the repair mechanisms are activated, and if you go below that threshold, the repair systems within the cell, the reparative enzymes, are turned off, and so they're turned off to the point where they can't repair normal damage, and so you actually increase your risk by turning off these reparative enzyme systems. These are all very controversial, and currently the linear model is the one that's accepted. Now, there is some data to suggest that the linear model, just recently a paper published in Radiology suggests that that model has been reduced down. The lower limit, which was at one threshold, has now been lowered by a factor of 10 and still has followed the linear model. So I think that we're probably pretty close with that value. So taking that into account, the federal government has defined occupational exposure limits. And if you look at non-occupational total body exposure, 0.1 rem per year or 100 millirem per year is currently the regulatory guideline. That's 2 millirem per week. And I can tell you that 2 millirem per week is a very low level of background, considering that the natural background radiation is 300 millirem per year. To 100 millirem per year above that as the non-occupational total body exposure is a very low threshold. I think if you looked at any industry besides the nuclear industry, you'd see that, for example, the airline industry, pilots may not be allowed to fly more than about 1 or 2 transcontinental flights a month if they were to follow the same guideline because of the increased radiation from getting above the filtering effect of the atmosphere. But in terms of occupational exposures, we follow the 5,000 millirems per year total body dose, and we monitor all of our employees that work with radiation using CLD badges and radiation monitors to make sure that they don't exceed that 5,000 millirems per year. Most of our employees in nuclear medicine are well below that. The highest dose in the hospital last year was actually in fluoroscopy in vascular surgery, as a matter of fact, and it was about 1,200 millirem total body for the year. That's the highest dose in the hospital by far. The nuclear medicine technologists that work with me receive on the order of really just above this 100 to 300 millirem or so occupational exposure. So if we look at the risk from that 100 millirem per year, epidemiological studies would extrapolate down to about 10 cases of thyroid cancer per million people at that dose, or 2 cases of leukemia per million people at that dose. And if you compare that to the risk of other things in our environment, for example, 1 million smokers are expected to have 1,000 cancer deaths per year, and 1 million drivers are about 560 automobile accidents out of 1 million drivers per year. So it's when you look at the numbers in terms of the epidemiologic risk from the background radiation threshold for non-occupational exposure, it's very low compared to the other risks in our daily lives. And you have to put it in context as well. The astronauts on Apollo flights were exposed to higher levels of radiation. This is a current consideration with planning for Mars flights. But the occupational exposures were low for Apollo 11, a little bit higher for Apollo 14, which was a little bit out of the radiation protection belt of the Earth. And but you had to put it in context with what the risk of the actual mission were, and it was very low compared to that. So the significant exposure criteria, now defined by the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is for a whole body dose, if you can remember 25 rem, that is what's considered the occupational exposure, above which they will begin to track your exposure and track you lifelong in a exposure registry. And that exposure registry can be obtained by looking on the Department of Energy website. It used to be available on the ORISE or the ORAL website, but I can't find it now. So I think you have to actually go out there, and you could probably access that. But 25 rem or 25,000 millirem is the current exposure criteria above which that they will track you, and that is available through the REACT site in Oak Ridge, and I'll mention them again in a little bit. If you look at that site tracked through the year 2000, from 1944 through August of 2000, the total number of United States fatalities in people involved in radiation accidents that were exposed over that 25 rem is 30 fatalities in 60 years, which is a fairly remarkable statistic considering when you compare that to other industries. I think last month, the last 2 months, in the coal industry, we saw nearly 70 deaths in North America, and so if you look at this over a 56-year period and now extended to 2005, really a 60-year period with a remarkable safety record. Outside the United States, an additional 97 fatalities for a total of 127. Now, there is additional data still coming in. This is not from Florida State University. This is from the former Soviet Union. And there are still accidents that went unreported in the former Soviet Union that we're beginning to learn about. And that number may change, and it may change significantly as we learn about those. Now, the number of persons involved in the non-United States, 132,000 here with significant exposures. Of course, most of those came from the Chernobyl accident. Prior to Chernobyl, that number was considerably smaller. And most of those accidents have occurred in three classifications: criticality accidents, radiation device accidents, and radioisotope accidents. And the vast majority of these have been in the radiation device category with sealed sources. These are typically industrial radiography sources that have been either stolen or misused or lost and found by unsuspecting individuals who find these very high-level radioactive sources that are used for industrial X-ray or industrial radiography. And I'll mention a few of those. If you look at this by year, you can see that criticality accidents, which are in gray, occurred predominantly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they've been relatively rare for the last 3 decades, with the one exception that everyone probably remembers in 1999, the Tokumura accident in Japan, which was a criticality accident. Radioisotope accidents have occurred as well, especially during the atomic weapons testing programs in the 60s, but there have been a number of medical misadministration accidents as well, and most of those have had to do with misadministration of therapy doses of iodine-131, many of those in pregnancy. And then the vast majority of accidents have occurred with radiation devices, and most of those, as you can see, in the 60s and 70s, and then with stricter regulations in the 90s, those accidents have significantly declined. So we hope that we'll have a little bit better control of those types of incidents in the future. In terms of radiography accidents, there are really 3 types: medical fluoroscopy, which can cause skin injury, and industrial radiography with accidental exposures, and then radioisotopes, as I mentioned, with misadministration and fallout accidents. Now, medical fluoroscopy injuries have occurred for a variety of things. This is a list of some of the things that have been reported to the Food and Drug Administration in which patients receive significant exposures. And most of these are fairly complex medical procedures that require a lot of fluoroscopy time. The patient's under a fluoroscopy beam for a fairly long period of time trying to do a complicated treatment procedure. Some of the ablation procedures and so forth, treatment for portosystemic shunts, But if you notice right in the middle here, coronary angioplasty, that's a routine procedure today in virtually every major medical center, balloon angioplasty and stent placement in coronary arteries. And if you look at one that was reported and actually presented to the FDA a few years ago, this was a patient who had a coronary angioplasty done, and he underwent X-ray fluoroscopy. At 1 week after the procedure, he had a skin burn, which appeared to heal at 1 month, and then the skin necrosed and broke down with a fairly large ulcer at 6 months that required skin grafting. This is something that we've had to call attention to our physicians who use fluoroscopy, because physicians, as a rule, and me included, tend to downplay the effects of radiation. And so we've had to and there are a lot of people who don't have specific radiation training that use radiation in the hospital. And there are nurses, there's technicians that are not radiology technicians. There's physicians who use fluoroscopy units in the hospital. So at UT, and if I want to mention that the number of these procedures is growing exponentially over time. The number of cardiac catheterizations, you can see, has significantly increased in the last 20 years. So at UT, what we've done is put in place a fluoroscopic privilege certification exam. And I can tell you that our orthopedic surgeons who have to take this exam in order to use fluoroscopy in the operating room, they don't like this. And they come to me on a regular basis and say, why do I have to take this exam? And I carry that picture around of this patient from a cardiac cath in my pocket. And whenever anybody asks me, I just pull that picture out and say, this is why. And I've never heard, I get fewer and fewer questions all the time about it now. So I think they begin to understand that this isn't just something that you step on the pedal and keep the fluoro unit on while you're doing the procedure and just let it run, that this stuff really can cause injury. So we see a little bit better utilization now. And the device manufacturers have become more savvy to the potential increased doses as well. And now they use pulsed units and so forth, limits on the amount of exposure that the tube will stay on and that sort of thing. So it's better now than what it was. I think that's. Now in terms of industrial radiography, this is typically with some of the devices that were manufactured in the 60s and 70s, in which they used large isotope sources encased in these leaded containers that had a window that was triggered open with a remote switch. So the user would put the device out and then back away 100 feet or so, however long the line would allow them to, and then they would expose, by pulling the trigger, expose the source, take their X-ray, and then when they released the trigger, that source was supposed to be closed back up again, and they would wind it up and go to their next site. Well, that didn't always happen the right way, and these sources were not always placed in these containers in a way that they couldn't get out. And in fact, in this particular case, a quality control inspector had one of those devices in which he was holding it in his hand after he had used it, and the window had failed to shut. And so he was kind of putting his finger over the window. It was kind of a habit that he would put his finger over the window, and he put his index finger over it, and then a little while later he put his little finger over it, and then he realized, that window's not shut. And if you looked at the dose that his finger received, you can see he received literally 500,000 rads to his fingertip, and he lost his fingertip as a result of that exposure. Now that was kind of a minor one. He had because it was really limited to the hand. But in this particular case, this is an industrial radiography source that fell out of its container and fell off the truck and was laying by the side of the road. And two young boys, picked this source up. It had the 25 curie source, and they began to play with it like a drumstick, began to hold it and took it home, and they had it in a drawer at home for a period of weeks before they were able to track it down. It was reported missing. They went looking for it. They were finally able to track this source down, and this is the injury to one of these boys' hands that occurred as a result of holding this device. These boys actually, like kids will do with a pen, they put it in their mouth and they did all sorts of things with it. But this is an example of that injury that occurred, and this is the arteriogram showing the complete necrosis and lack of vasculature in that part of the hand. Now, these two boys, this is a picture after they healed, but you notice that the family was irradiated for up to 6 weeks at a total dose of up to 2,800 rads. That was a prolonged exposure, and so these individuals are being followed. I don't know the long-term outcome on these two boys. It hasn't been reported yet, but that's something that certainly will be followed long-term by the Oak Ridge group. They developed a hematopoietic syndrome, and but their cell counts recovered. Now, this is one that happened here locally. This is one that happened in a seed irradiation experiment here at UT in 1971. This was a graduate student who was doing experiments on seed irradiation, and this was a container that had a 7700 Curie cobalt-60 source. The source was supposed to be down in this lead container when the door was was open. But for whatever reason, this student ignored the warning lights, and when he opened the door, the system malfunctioned. The siren didn't go off, but the warning lights went off and said that this source was exposed. But he either didn't see it or didn't heed it, and walked up to the side of this device, had his seeds here on a cup next to the source that was out exposed, and he realized a couple minutes later, hey, that source is supposed to be down in the container. I'm being irradiated. And so he got out, and he had received about 260 rem total body dose, mostly to the upper body, and about 1,200 rem to the right hand. Now, the LD5030 for humans is about 350 to 400, so he received a rather significant, potentially lethal dose of radiation from that experiment. Now, if you look at his blood counts, you look at the first few as the first days, and then the next several weeks, out to about 10 weeks, 12 weeks, and then several months. And you can see that here at about 40 days, somewhere about 6 weeks, the platelets reach a nadir. And the same is true really for the white count, in which the total white blood cell count reaches a nadir of about 2,000. 2,000 is a low normal value for total white cell count, and then it recovered. And then the red cell count also reached a nadir about the same time, so somewhere around 6 weeks. But if you look at the absolute lymphocyte count, which is this black line here, the very first clue that this was a significant exposure comes from the first lymphocyte count being acquired, and then a few hours later, the next lymphocyte count showing a rather dramatic drop. And that's actually one of the clues that this is a significant whole body exposure without doing chromosomal analysis. And in fact, if you look at the drop in lymphocyte count, if it drops down to a level of about 1,500, you can almost plot the dose as a result of the actual lymphocyte drop over a period of 1 to 2 days. In fact, you can usually plot this in a period of hours for people with significant exposure. And you can almost make a prediction of their outcome based on this initial drop. So that is one of the things that comes from the ORI's website, the REACT's website, and it's something I point our residents to on a regular basis to kind of review these values in case we were to have an accident a patient admitted to UT with this kind of problem. Now, in Dr. Huebner's book, they reported that this individual was alive and well at age 40, which was 8 years after the accident. He had normal blood counts at that time. He had a healthy daughter 7 years after the accident, so interestingly, we would have almost predicted that he would have been sterile from the dose that he received, but he was not. But about 2 years after the book was published, I called his physician, and about 2 years after the book was published, this individual developed leukemia and died from leukemia very rapidly. Didn't respond to treatment very well at all. And that was most certainly due to his exposure from 8 or 9 years, 8 to 10 years before that. In terms of radioisotope injuries, there are medical misadministrations and sealed source accidents, but the majority of radioisotope injuries have really come from fallout accidents. I-131 misadministrations, we use I-131 almost daily in nuclear medicine for treatment of thyroid cancer, and we use it in about 100 to 200 millicurie doses. Where the accidents have occurred have been in people that were going to get microcurie doses, and you know, if you write 100 microcuries, it kind of looks like millicuries, and they've been accidentally prescribed 100 millicuries by the nuclear medicine physician. We go to great pains to try to avoid that here, and hopefully we won't see that. But we don't use the microcurie doses very often anymore. We use I-123 for anything that requires a scan or an uptake, and I-123 is a pure gamma emitter. It doesn't have beta particles, so the dosimetry is very much less. So we hopefully won't see that in the future. But fallout accident victims, some of the epidemiology data from that is fairly interesting. And this really comes from atomic weapons testing. This is a case in 1954 in which shortly after a atomic weapons test in the South Pacific, the wind direction changed despite the best weather predictions, and a Japanese fishing boat that was nearby literally was covered with ash from this fallout. As a matter of fact, the ash reported on that was literally caked onto the boat, and most of that ash was radioactive fallout debris, and there were 23 individuals exposed, one of whom died shortly after the accident from a radiation injury. The total estimated doses in these individuals were anywhere from 220 to almost 600 rem, and of those, the 22 remaining individuals were followed for 25 years and had only one death out of those 22. In terms of the Marshallese people who were downwind from that, there were another 239 individuals exposed and only one death after another 10 years. Now, if you look at those people that were exposed, however, thyroid disease significantly increased. These are 3 different groups of individuals. I can't pronounce these, I apologize, but these groups, the Rongelap group was actually the closest to the accident, and then the Uteric was a little farther away, and then unexposed was even farther, and you can see the incidence of thyroid nodules increased significantly in the closer group, and the incidence of thyroid cancer also increased significantly in that group. And that's actually what we're seeing again in the Chernobyl group. In the individuals who were children at the time of Chernobyl, the incidence in thyroid cancer has increased anywhere from 20 to 100-fold, depending on how you look at the data, but somewhere around 50-fold increase in thyroid cancer incidence. But otherwise, I'm not aware of any health-related disease from the Chernobyl, other than in the acutely injured individuals in that. And I'll show some data on that in just a moment. In terms of criticality accidents, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl are the 2 that we think of, and then the processing facility accident in Tokumura. There have been a number of these. Now, I hesitate a little bit in going through this history, but the criticality accidents kind of The background behind that is to understand criticality. I don't really need to explain that to this group, except that it was conceived by Leo Szilard back in the 1930s. If any of you have read the book Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, it was a fascinating history of the atomic age, and Leo Szilard is very prominent in that history. He's the one who conceived of the chain reaction. If you could find enough of an isotope that would give off neutrons as it decayed. And of course, we now know uranium-235 and plutonium-239 are those isotopes. And they, when they fission, they give off neutrons. And it really just takes a certain quantity of that material put in proximity to generate a chain reaction. And it's not much. I was surprised to see this, and of course this is not news to you, but it was to me, that the amount of enrichment, if you only get to about 50% enrichment of uranium-235, it only takes about 800 grams of uranium-235 to create a chain reaction. That was about the size of a golf ball, maybe. Not very much to try to generate a chain reaction. So it's possible, just by getting enough of this in proximity, to accidentally initiate a chain reaction, and that's what's happened at these processing plants for uranium-235 and uranium hexafluoride. Enrico Fermi demonstrated it with the first reactor in 1942 under the stadium bleachers at the University of Chicago, and then they took that reactor apart brick by brick, transferred it here to Oak Ridge, and that stands out in Oak Ridge now as the graphite reactor. I don't know how many of you have been able to go out to see that, but it's a fascinating tour. I think you have to go through the Oak Ridge Museum of Science and Energy now to get out to that reactor, but it's this reactor is a national landmark that can be visited if you go through the museum there. Modern reactors, though, use the moderators, the shielding, and so they don't have the problem with the graphite that the original reactors did. But if all you have to do is get enough uranium in one place to create a reactor, I kind of asked one of the radiation safety guys at Oak Ridge if it's ever been demonstrated that that could have occurred naturally. And he pointed me to this site. He said, of course it's happened naturally. Aklo, West Africa, in the mines, they've identified isotope distribution, which is identical to the spent fuel isotopes that we see in modern day reactors. And the history of that is interesting. This is what I think may be that evolutionary pressure that Deinococcus radiodurans may have grown up in this area, where there was actually a natural reactor upwards of 2 billion years ago in the underground and under the lakes in West Africa. Well, reactors, this chart is something that you have on your walls. I noticed when I walked in here with the number of reactor facilities, both nationwide and worldwide. And the two accidents of note have been the 3 Mile Island Unit 2 meltdown and the Chernobyl accident. And in 3 Mile Island, in March of 1979, I won't go through the details, but this is a contained unit with a concrete containment structure, and it's a reactor in which for whatever reason, and I don't know the details, the coolant was allowed to boil away without being noticed, and that reactor melted down. But except for a small amount that leaked through one of the pump housings, most of that activity was contained in the containment structure from the meltdown. And in fact, if you looked at the dosimetry map on this, the maximum dose was 0.1 rem at the 3 Mile Island boundary, which is 0.1 rem, 100 millirem, is our occupational exposure limit today, our non-occupational exposure limit today for people who don't wear a film badge as part of their routine work. The Pennsylvania Department of Public Health has monitored 30,000 people for 18 years with no adverse events, as would be expected from that low dose. Nevertheless, you can get online today and find all kinds of sites on 3 Mile Island which show 5-leaf clovers and everything else in that area that are attributed to 3 Mile Island accidents. So, in terms of Chernobyl, that's a different story. Chernobyl was really an environmental disaster. I think most of you are more aware of this than I am. But one of the reasons for this is that this was a reactor that had no external containment structure. There was some degree of delay in reporting it. So when it melted down, and it was a graphite reactor, so when it melted down, not only did it melt down and begin exposing the atmosphere without a containment structure, but that graphite, which acted as coal, basically started burning. And so they had fire crews there, they had all kinds of rescue workers, people that they call liquidators, that came in to help clean that up. And you can see that literally I-131, 50 million curies were released in the atmosphere from that accident. And there were 200,000 liquidators received a fairly high, in fact, significant exposures from that. I think the table that I showed earlier showed 127,000. The majority of those were the liquidators from the Chernobyl accident that received 25 rem or higher radiation dose. And they ended up evacuating about 130,000 people. 10% of those received more than 5 rem, and 5% received more than 10 rem total body dose. And the thyroid doses were fairly high, 30 to 500 rads. That's a fairly significant dose to the thyroid. And the health effects from that is that there were 237 individuals who were hospitalized with acute radiation syndrome and 28 fatalities from the radiation syndrome. 3 people died of cardiac disease, myocardial infarction, or heart attack. And there were 14 additional deaths in 10 years. But here's the real key on this, that thyroid cancer in people who were teenager or younger at the time of the accident, the incidence of thyroid cancer has increased about 50-fold compared to the pre-exposure rates. Now, thyroid cancer doesn't have a high incidence to begin with, but a 50-fold increase is hard to ignore. And that's the major health effect that I can see from Chernobyl. Nevertheless, you can get on the web and find all kinds of health effects from Chernobyl that are attributed to Chernobyl. And in fact, one particular website that I found I found because I think the show 2020 or 60 Minutes or one of these did a special on this particular organization, showed that they had actually 10 different syndromes that were attributed to Chernobyl, none of which were thyroid cancer or cancer related. They were all genetic cardiac disease and that sort of thing that we see every day everywhere, but they were attributing it to Chernobyl without really any good statistics. It would be interesting to know if there are other things, but the one that's clear that I can see is thyroid cancer. Now, that doesn't talk about the environmental impact from Chernobyl, and I'll leave that to your discussions in other classes, but just the health effects. In terms of processing facilities, the Tokamura site, Y-12 in 1958 had a very similar incident. These two incidents are almost identical, but basically it's in these facilities that are taking spent nuclear waste and trying to recycle that or process it for disposal. And in fact, this is the Y-12 site just down the road in which this barrel, this is a little bit hard to see on this slide, I apologize, it's a little dark. This barrel was being used to collect uranium hexafluoride waste, and it was allowed to simply accumulate too much of it. And that barrel actually got enough of it in proximity in the right geometry, it went critical, and 8 workers were exposed with fairly significant whole body doses. And of those 8 workers, 2 had died 21 years later, 1 from lung cancer and 1 from a stroke. He was 75 years old at the time that he died of stroke, and 6 of them were alive and well. 21 years after that accident. In fact, a few years ago, I was with Carl Huebner in the lunchroom at UT, and one of those individuals actually came up and introduced himself and said hello, because Carl had followed him as one of the Oak Ridge team physicians for a number of years. And he came over to say hello to Dr. Huebner, and he was in for what appeared to be unrelated things to his radiation exposure. So, in terms of the total number of accidents, 38 in 50 years, and 9 deaths at those processing facilities. And 2 of those deaths came from Tokumura in 1999, and I think that accident's been fairly well reported. The key with that was that the dose to the public, despite the severity of that accident, there was really about a 2,000 millirem maximum dose to the public, and the activity, that's a calculated dose to the public, that theoretical calculated value, but the activity at 20 hours within 90 meters of the facility was down to background radiation doses. So significant event, but well contained. These events, though, have led us to work with Oak Ridge and REACTS to develop radiation disaster response plans. And REACTS is much farther along, but we do have a radiation disaster plan at UT. It's important to differentiate between exposure and contamination. And our disaster plan is more for contaminated people and to try to control the entry of those isotopes into the hospital. So if somebody comes in who's contaminated, and actually happened a few years ago with a UT biology student who was contaminated with P32 from one of his accidents. It was long before. It was probably about 15 years ago, in which we had to try to decontaminate this individual with from his P32 exposure. And the key on this is that we teach our emergency room personnel, we teach our residents, we teach all of the individuals that trauma comes first. People who are injured get treated for their injuries. We'll worry about the contamination later. But in general, the radiation dose from contamination is very, very small. Obviously, we try to contain it so that no one else gets contaminated. But if somebody's seriously hurt, we allow them to work under the best that we can. And this is just a floor map of UT Hospital. The yellow being for non-injured individuals who are contaminated, the pink being for people who are contaminated, trying to keep them separate. So that's our plan. There are certain medical things that we do. The number one thing is checking for these blood counts and following those. And then just supportive care. The potential for bioterrorism has also come into play, and we're working with REACTS to develop that. And if any of you are interested, I don't know if you take this anyway, but the REACTS courses on handling of accidents by emergency personnel or medical personnel are actually very good. I've taken one of those courses. This information is also available from the REACTS site online, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's actually a pretty good instruction manual. And with that, I think I'll stop. This is what I've already mentioned. And there are guidelines for internal contamination for things to try to chelate some of these items and get them to be cleared from the body quicker. And with that, I'll stop and ask for any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions and comments from the audience. Reese, wait a minute. Use the microphone, please.
I remember back in 1945 being taken by my mother to a shoe store where they had a fluoroscope to see whether the shoes fit properly. I'm wondering, has anyone looked at the exposure people were getting from those machines before they were finally taken out of service? And I assume it was a public health threat.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the incidence of thyroid cancer in people who were exposed in that way is higher than in the general public. And the people who had treatment with radiation for acne very similarly has an increased incidence of thyroid cancer as well. again, it kind of gets back to the thyroid cancer. That's the biggest thing that we've seen a health effect in. But there is an increased incidence in that in people who had that. I can remember that too. So those machines too. But that is something that endocrinologists will actually take that history when they're evaluating somebody for thyroid disease. Did you ever have one of those X-ray shoe size measures? Part of their.
We have other questions. Zia from the back of the room.
Yes.
Hi. I had a question. Was there any validity to the health any kind of health effects due to the exposure of depleted uranium shells for the Army?
Depleted uranium shells in the Army. Well, you could look at the total X-ray exposure from those. It's far less than the 25 rem significant exposure. I think that the real key on uranium is internal uranium exposure, not the external exposure. Yeah. There is some exposure, but you could go calculate what that is. It's pretty low.
Okay, we do have one question, or really it's a comment from the cyber audience. And this comes from Dr. John Church. Hello, John. He usually tunes in to our webcast each Wednesday afternoon, and it has to do with a traditional debate we have between Macs and PCs, and so I feel obligated to read his comment. He says, Lee, the slides in today's talk are the best ever. Highly visible and viewable. They set the standard for all talks. Macs rule. Okay.
Thank you.
I should tell John that I think the quality of the slides are due to the new technology that we're using, which is the media site, and that he should see and would see if he had a PC, he would see the similar quality, high-quality slides using a PC in the future. So with that comment...
Don't believe it.
Okay. Everyone, we always seem to have a few new faces, and you may not know the new people that are here, that we do have a reception downstairs, and everyone is invited, and there's food down there. And Dr. Smith will be down there to answer more questions one-on-one. But before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation again to Gary Smith for his presentation.